Picture a machine that needs to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Every year, you have to feed it more fuel. Every year, the gears spin harder. But the machine isn't going anywhere. It's just getting louder, getting hotter, and the people standing next to it are starting to realize they're trapped inside it. That's the Canadian economy right now. And the fuel is people. In 2023, Canada brought in over 1.2 million new residents. That's the equivalent of adding the entire population of Calgary in a single year. To put that in perspective, Canada's population growth rate hit 3.2%, higher than most developing nations, higher than India, higher than Mexico. We're talking about sub-Saharan African levels of population growth in a G7 country that can barely build a subway line without a decade of consultations. The government says this is necessary. They say we need more workers to support an aging population. They say immigration drives economic growth. They point to GDP numbers and say, look, we're thriving. And on paper, they're not wrong. The total size of the economy is growing. But here's what they don't say. We didn't build 1.2 million new homes. We didn't open 1.2 million new hospital beds. We didn't hire 1.2 million new teachers or build 1.2 million new transit seats. We just added the people and told them to figure it out. So what happens when you dump demand into a system that has no supply? You get a crisis. And not just any crisis, a very specific kind of economic trap that turns a country into a Ponzi scheme. Today, we're going to explain the mechanism. We're going to show you why Canada needs mass immigration to keep the lights on, and why that same immigration is making it impossible for anyone under 40 to build a life here. This is the story of how a country with infinite space somehow ran out of room. Let's start with the part the government actually admits. Canada has a demographic problem. The baby boomers are retiring. In the 1970s, there were 7 working-age Canadians for every retiree. Today, it's closer to 3. By 2040, it could be 2 to 1. That's a disaster for a welfare state. Our healthcare system, our pensions, our entire social safety net depends on young workers paying taxes to support older retirees. When the ratio flips, the math breaks. You need more workers just to keep the system solvent. So immigration becomes the pressure release valve. Bring in young workers. They pay income tax. They contribute to CPP and EI. They spend money at Tim Hortons and Shoppers Drug Mart. They keep the Ponzi going. And for a while, it works. The headline GDP number goes up. Politicians stand in front of cameras and say, Canada added 200,000 jobs last quarter. The credit rating agencies nod approvingly. International investors keep buying Canadian bonds. Everything looks fine. But here's the trick. They're measuring the wrong thing. Imagine a pizza. If you have a pizza and 4 people, everyone gets 2 slices. Now imagine 10 cousins show up unannounced. Suddenly you have 14 people and the same pizza. The household can technically claim that total pizza consumption is up. More people are eating, but everyone's slice just got smaller. That's what's happening to Canada. The economy is growing in aggregate, but per person, we're getting poorer. Since 2015, GDP per capita in Canada has been flat or falling. We're one of the only G7 countries where the average person is worse off than they were a decade ago. While Americans saw their per capita income rise by over 15%, Canadians saw theirs stagnate or decline. The pie got bigger, but we added so many people to the table that your slice actually shrunk. You feel poorer because you are poorer. The immigration isn't creating new wealth. It's just diluting the existing wealth across more people. This is what economists call capital dilution. You're spreading the same amount of infrastructure, the same number of hospital beds, the same roads and schools and houses across a rapidly expanding population. And the result is that everything feels more crowded, more expensive, and more broken. And this is where the housing crisis becomes inevitable. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. When you add 1 million people a year, but you only build 240,000 homes, basic supply and demand takes over. Prices explode. In Toronto, the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment hit $2,500 a month in 2024. In Vancouver, it's closer to $3,000. That's not because landlords suddenly got greedier. It's because 50 people are competing for the same unit. When you have international students, young professionals, and families all bidding on the same basement apartment, the price goes to whoever is most desperate. The newcomers aren't the problem. They didn't create this. The policy did. We created a system where demand was weaponized against supply. And the people making the policy, the politicians and the bureaucrats, they own homes. Their wealth is tied up in real estate. So they have no incentive to crash the market. They benefit from the crisis. But here's where it gets darker. The government can't stop. They're trapped in the Ponzi. If immigration drops significantly, the GDP growth disappears. The headline number that politicians use to claim success evaporates. Tax revenues fall because there are fewer workers paying into the system. The debt-to-GDP ratio spikes because the denominator shrinks. The credit rating agencies start circling. Suddenly, Canada looks less like a stable investment and more like a country in structural decline. Canada's entire economic model for the last decade has been this. Add more people, call it growth, and hope nobody checks the per capita numbers. It's the economic equivalent of a pyramid scheme. You need constant new entrants at the bottom to pay off the people at the top. The moment the flow stops, the illusion collapses. And there's another layer to this that nobody wants to talk about. Cheap labor. By flooding the market with workers, wages stay suppressed. If you're a business owner and you have 500 applicants for an entry-level job, why would you raise wages? You don't need to. You don't need to invest in automation or training or productivity improvements. You just hire another desperate newcomer for minimum wage. This keeps costs down for corporations, but it keeps incomes down for workers. Let's talk about what this looks like in practice. Walk into any Tim Hortons, any Subway, any retail store in a major Canadian city. The workers are overwhelmingly newcomers. Many of them are international students working off the books beyond their legal 20-hour limit because they can't survive otherwise. They're being exploited, but the system depends on that exploitation. It keeps labor costs low. It keeps the service economy humming. And it keeps wages from rising for everyone else. This is a wealth transfer. From workers to owners. From renters to landlords. From the young to the old. The policy looks progressive on a pamphlet. It sounds compassionate. But in practice, it operates like 19th century robber baron capitalism. It benefits the people who own assets and hire labor at the expense of the people who work for wages and pay rent. So we have stagnant wages, exploding costs, and a government that can't turn off the immigration tap without collapsing the illusion of growth. That's the Ponzi. It only works if it keeps expanding. The moment it stops, the whole thing unravels. The debt becomes unsustainable. The services collapse. The facade falls away. And the cruelest part? The people hurt the most are the immigrants themselves. They were sold a lie. Recruiters in India, Nigeria, the Philippines, they told them Canada was the land of opportunity. Come here, get an education, get permanent residency, build a life. They arrived and found themselves sleeping to a basement in Brampton, delivering Uber Eats in minus 20-degree weather, paying $30,000 a year in tuition to strip mall colleges that exist solely to print diplomas for visa applications. These colleges have names you've never heard of. They operate out of office buildings in industrial parks. They're not about education. They're about immigration. They're selling a product, and that product is access to Canada. The students know it. The colleges know it. The government knows it. But nobody stops it because the system needs the labor. These newcomers aren't immigrants in the traditional sense. They're economic fuel. They're the logs being fed into the machine to keep it running just a little bit longer. And when they realize the promise was a lie, when they realize they're trapped in low-wage jobs with no path forward, some of them leave. They go back home. They tell their friends and family, "Don't come. It's not what they said it was." But many can't leave. They've invested everything. They've burned bridges. They've taken on debt. So they stay and they grind. And the resentment builds. Meanwhile, the younger generation, the people who were born here, they look at this and they realize the game is rigged. You can't compete with someone who's willing to sleep on a mattress in a living room and split rent 6 ways. You can't save for a down payment when rent is eating 60% of your paycheck. You can't start a family when a 2-bedroom condo costs $800,000 and you need a household income of $200,000 just to qualify for a mortgage. So what do? You delay. You put off having kids. Canada's fertility rate has collapsed to 1.33 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. We're literally choosing not to reproduce because we made it too expensive. You put off buying a home. The average age of a first-time homebuyer in Toronto is now pushing 38. That's a decade and a half later than it was in the 1990s. That's a decade of lost wealth accumulation, of lost stability, of lost time. Or you leave. The brain drain accelerates. If you're a software engineer from Waterloo, why would you stay? You look south and see Seattle or Austin offering double the salary and half the cost of living. If you're a doctor from McGill, you see American hospitals offering $400,000 a year while you're making $250,000 and waiting 6 months to get an MRI for your own patients. The skilled workers vote with their feet. And who's left? The old, sitting on their $2 million homes, voting to restrict new development to protect their property values. The indebted, trapped in jobs they hate because they can't afford to miss a rent payment. And the people who can't afford to leave, grinding it out in the hope that something will change. Canada risks becoming a nation of landlords and renters, with no middle class in between. A country where your future is determined not by your talent or your work ethic, but by whether your parents bought a house in 1995. It's a feudal system, the landed gentry and the serfs. And the government, stuck in the middle, trying to keep the whole thing from collapsing. Because here's the trap. Real estate and construction make up about 15% of Canada's GDP. If housing prices crash, the banks become insolvent. They've lent out trillions in mortgages backed by inflated property values. If those values fall by 30 or 40%, the whole financial system is at risk. The pension funds, which are heavily invested in real estate, take massive losses. Retirees who were counting on their home equity to fund their retirement suddenly find themselves underwater. So the government is trapped between two impossible choices. Let housing prices keep rising, which locks out the young and destroys social mobility. Or let prices crash, which destroys the savings of the old and potentially triggers a financial crisis. They've chosen option one. Sacrifice the young to protect the old. Keep the Ponzi running. They introduce policies that look like they're helping, but actually just extend the problem. 30-year amortizations so people can afford bigger mortgages. First-time homebuyer incentives that just push prices higher. They're adding air to the balloon, hoping it doesn't pop on their watch. So is there a way out? Technically, yes. But it requires admitting that the last decade of policy was a mistake. You'd have to build. Massively. You'd have to flood the market with supply until prices crash. Rezone entire neighborhoods for mid-rise apartments. Override the NIMBYs who show up to city council meetings to block every development. Accept that housing needs to be cheaper even if it means your parents' nest egg takes a hit. You'd have to slow immigration to match the pace of construction. Not stop it, not close the borders, but calibrate it to what the country can actually absorb. If you can build 250,000 homes a year, then bring in 250,000 people. It's not complicated math. And you'd have to shift the economy away from real estate speculation and cheap labor toward actual productivity. Invest in technology. Invest in automation. Invest in industries that create high-wage jobs. Streamline regulations so you can actually build mines and factories and infrastructure without a decade of consultations. Stop treating the resource sector like a moral failure and start treating it like the economic engine it is. But that requires political courage. It requires telling older voters that their home is not a retirement fund. It's a house, and its value needs to come down so their grandchildren can live in this country. It requires telling corporations that the era of cheap labor is over. You need to pay real wages and invest in productivity. It requires telling newcomers the truth. We can't absorb 1 million people a year. We don't have the capacity. None of this will happen. Not under the current system. Because the people who benefit from the status quo are the people who vote. The homeowners, the retirees, the landlords. They have no incentive to change anything. And the people getting crushed, the young, the newcomers, the renters, they're either too exhausted to fight or they're leaving. So the machine keeps running. Faster and faster. Louder and louder. Until something breaks. If you're watching this and you feel that tightness in your chest when you look at rent prices, when you see the for sale signs on houses you'll never afford, you're not imagining it. The system is designed to extract from you. You're not failing. You didn't do anything wrong. The machine is broken. And until we stop pretending that adding more fuel will fix it, the gears will just keep grinding faster, louder, and hotter until something finally snaps. The Ponzi only works until it doesn't. And we're running out of time to choose how it ends. Either we dismantle it carefully, deliberately, with a plan to soften the blow, or we wait for it to collapse on its own and deal with the wreckage. The question is, will you still be standing next to it when it does? If this resonated, hit subscribe. We're going to keep pulling back the curtain on the math they don't want you to see. Drop a comment and tell me, are you staying and fighting, or are you one of the people looking for the exit? I want to know.